Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling like you'd just been studied, not heard, not seen, but quietly mapped? Like someone was smiling just enough, nodding just right, asking the kind of questions that felt caring, but landed too close to your core. That's not kindness, that's strategy. And if you've ever felt it, you weren't imagining things. You were being read like a blueprint. Because not all evil is loud. Some of it wears warmth. Some of it offers help. Some of it listens patiently, not to understand you, but to locate your vulnerabilities, to sketch out your weak spots, to collect what you fear, not with interrogation, but with subtlety. The most dangerous people don't control with force, they control with access. They learn what makes you hesitate, what you over-explain, what you secretly hope no one will ask. They memorize your emotional loops, where you freeze, where you fawn, where you explain more than you should. And when the moment is right, they don't strike. They nudge, they mirror, they suggest, and suddenly you're doubting yourself for no clear reason. You say yes just to keep the peace. You reveal more than you meant to. You stay silent when something feels off, just so you don't seem rude. But underneath that stillness, you know, something's wrong. Something isn't safe. You tell yourself, maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm overthinking. But you're not. You're sensing, and you're sensing correctly. Because manipulation in the modern age isn't about domination. It's about narrative control. It's not shouting orders. It's quietly shifting your story without you noticing. The Stoics knew this long before it had a name. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The closer someone pretends to be, the more cautious you should become." He wasn't being cynical, he was being clear. Because true evil doesn't show up in shadows. It shows up smiling. It asks questions with soft eyes. It waits patiently for you to give it the keys to your own mind. So if you've ever walked away from someone feeling smaller, unsteady, or like you've just handed over something sacred without meaning to, this is for you. You're not paranoid, you're perceptive. And once you learn how to see the pattern, you won't just protect yourself, you'll become unreadable. And when they can't read you, they can't reach you. There was a man named Daniel, quiet, observant, always smiling, the kind of colleague who never made waves, who offered to help without asking for anything in return, who always knew just when to say, "That must be hard," or "I really admire your strength." People liked Daniel, trusted him, confided in him. They believed he was emotionally intelligent. In truth, Daniel was emotionally strategic. He never talked much about himself. He didn't need to. He let others fill the space. He asked small, careful questions. He nodded with just enough silence to make others keep talking. He remembered what you feared, what you avoided, what made you doubt yourself. He never interrupted. He never corrected. He just listened and stored and waited. One day, a junior designer named Leah joined the company. Bright, creative, deeply sensitive. The kind of person who wears their passion on their sleeve. She shared ideas eagerly, stayed late, wanted to be liked. In her first week, Daniel took her out for coffee. He said things like, "You remind me of how I used to be." He asked, "What's the hardest part of being new here?" Then he waited. Leah told him everything. How she sometimes overthinks. How she worries she's not technical enough. How her last boss made her feel small. She laughed when she said it. Daniel didn't. He just smiled and nodded and filed it all away. Weeks passed. Leah felt close to him, safe, like she finally had someone who understood her. So when he made casual comments like, "You've been quieter in meetings lately," or "Some people don't always value creative minds here," she took them seriously. She started second-guessing herself. She spoke less. She questioned her place. She lost confidence slowly, silently, until one day, in a meeting with directors, a presentation she worked on was credited to Daniel. She froze. He smiled and said, "Leah had some early input too," then kept going. She looked at him. He didn't blink. And in that moment, she understood. He had been mapping her, not mentoring her. That's how manipulation works in the modern age. It doesn't push, it pulls. It doesn't correct you, it lets you doubt yourself. A blueprint extractor doesn't need to force you, they just need access. Access to your thoughts, your patterns, your fears. And once they have that, they don't control your actions. They shift your perception. You begin to believe what they never had to say out loud. And this is where the Stoic perspective becomes vital. A Stoic doesn't avoid people. He observes them. He doesn't share his doubts as currency. He treats them as sacred. Epictetus taught that we must listen with our whole mind before we speak with our mouth. The modern version? Just because someone is listening doesn't mean they deserve your truth. Ask yourself, does this person earn insight into me, or do they harvest it? Are they revealing anything in return, or do they remain a shadow with a smile? The Stoic protects the inner citadel, not with walls, but with discipline. You don't need to be cold, but you must be selective. If someone hasn't shown consistency, respect, and integrity, they haven't earned access to your blueprint. Don't hand them the knife and act surprised when they cut. Because here's what most people miss. Manipulators don't break you by pushing. They break you by watching, by nodding, by knowing exactly when to echo your fear back at you. They don't create the fear. They wait until you do, and then they weaponize it. Leah didn't lose herself in one moment. She leaked herself, one vulnerable share at a time. And Daniel, he never had to lie. He just didn't have to stop her. This is how good people become predictable. Not because they're weak, but because they're open. Oversharing feels like connection. But with the wrong person, it becomes exposure. Presence distortion. A slow erosion of clarity. So next time someone seems too understanding, too ready to listen, too quick to mirror your thoughts, pause. Ask yourself not what they said, but what they now know. You don't need to fear every listener, but you do need to test for reciprocity. If their silence gathers but never gives, you're not building trust. You're being studied. The Stoic understands this. He holds his fears close, not because he's ashamed of them, but because he knows their power. And he will not let another wield what he must master. Because when they can't access your fear, they can't reroute your future. And that's how you begin to outsmart them, not by fighting louder, but by becoming unreadable. Natalie was fresh out of grad school when she landed her first job at a consulting firm. She was bright, eager, and deeply grateful for the opportunity. Her manager, Paul, noticed this immediately. He welcomed her warmly, gave her a list of unspoken tips for navigating the office culture, even took time to coach her before her first big presentation. When she thanked him, he just smiled and said, "We've all been there. Just pass it on when it's your turn." For a while, everything felt solid. Natalie trusted him. She worked late when he asked, covered his reports when he was behind, and spoke up for him in client meetings. It felt like loyalty. It felt like teamwork. Then one Friday evening, Paul asked her to adjust a few minor numbers in a report. "It's nothing big," he said almost apologetically. "They just want the projection to look optimistic. And you know how much pressure we're under to hit Q3 targets." Natalie hesitated, but then he added, "After everything I've done to help you settle in, this is just a small ask." She did it, not because she agreed, but because she didn't want to seem ungrateful, because somewhere in her mind, she believed saying no would undo all the goodwill, the guidance, the kindness he had shown. That moment changed something in her. Not because she lost her integrity entirely, but because she felt the leash tighten. The next ask came easier. The next silence felt more necessary. And over time, Natalie wasn't saying yes to the task. She was saying yes to the debt. A debt she never agreed to, but one that had been silently accumulating under the surface. This is the trap of manipulative indebtedness. Good manipulators don't force you to obey. They just create a subtle narrative that makes refusal feel like betrayal. They lend you emotional currency, then convert it into moral obligation. You didn't sign a contract, but you act like you did. It's a classic bait. Generosity with an invisible invoice, and most decent people fall for it. Not because they're naive, but because they were raised to repay kindness, taught that loyalty means bending, conditioned to believe that rejecting a favor is a failure of character. But the Stoic doesn't trade principle for peace. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." He didn't say, unless someone once helped you. He didn't say, unless you feel guilty. Virtue isn't conditional. Integrity isn't situational. This is where the internal fortress must hold. The Stoic mind recognizes that manipulation often hides behind gratitude. That guilt can be weaponized. That favors can become chains if you let them. Ask yourself, is this a request or a recall on a favor? Am I acting out of principle or pressure? Am I giving back or paying off something I never truly owed? When Paul said, "After everything I've done for you," what he really meant was, "You owe me your silence." But Natalie didn't owe him her silence. She owed herself her honesty. The danger of unexamined loyalty is this: it makes you compliant in your own erosion. Not all submission is loud. Some of it looks like helpfulness. Some of it wears the mask of being a team player. But deep down you feel it. The cognitive leak, the moral bandwidth theft, a silent tug of war between your values and your perceived obligations. This is how people with good hearts become controlled. You don't need to burn every bridge, but you must stop confusing manipulation for mentorship. Stop calling guilt guidance. Just because someone opened a door for you doesn't mean they get to choose where you go next. Natalie eventually walked away. She didn't explode. She didn't expose him. She just stopped playing. She rebuilt her clarity piece by piece, not by fighting Paul, but by reclaiming the parts of herself she'd outsourced to his approval. That's the Stoic approach. No drama, no rage, just a clean return to principle. So if someone reminds you of what they once did for you, pause, ask what they're trying to cash in, and remember this: generosity without freedom is not kindness, it's bait. And true character is not how well you repay a favor. It's how well you protect your values when someone tries to collect. Because the moment you choose clarity over guilt, the chain breaks. And that's when they realize they never owned you. They only borrowed your hesitation. Elias had just landed his dream role. Creative director at one of the most prestigious firms in his industry. He was glowing, celebrated. After years of quiet effort, he finally felt seen. His inbox overflowed with congratulations. His phone buzzed with admiration. And people who had once overlooked him now leaned in with smiles and flattery. One of them was Victor, a former acquaintance who hadn't spoken to Elias in years. Victor showed up with warmth, laughter, and a line that sounded harmless. "You always had it in you." I'm not surprised. It felt good, familiar, safe. They met for dinner. Victor talked about opportunity, potential, big moves. And then softly he said, "I'm working on something. Private project, early stage. You'd be perfect as a silent investor. Just between us." Elias was flattered. The idea felt like the next step. He didn't ask many questions. He said yes. 6 months later, the deal collapsed. The company never existed. The money was gone. And Victor, unreachable. The sting wasn't just financial, it was emotional. Elias hadn't just been tricked. He let it happen. Because in his joy, he had stopped thinking. That's the paradox. We expect betrayal when we're broken, but manipulators often wait for joy. Because happiness lowers the shield. Success suspends scrutiny. When everything is going well, we assume everyone is on our side. And that assumption is the gap where influence walks in. The Stoics warned of this. Seneca wrote, "No emotion, even joy, should be allowed to overthrow reason." He wasn't against happiness, he was for clarity. Because the most dangerous decisions are often made in delight. Joy is not the absence of threat. Sometimes it's the bait. Manipulators understand emotional momentum. They know that when you're high on progress, validation, or love, you're more likely to say yes to requests, to stories, to people you'd usually evaluate more carefully. In that moment, it doesn't feel like a trap. It feels like destiny. Elias isn't alone. Olivia, a young woman recently engaged, experienced the same lesson. In the swirl of celebrations, compliments, and champagne toasts, her fiancé's brother pulled her aside with a smile. "Now that you're family," he said, "you're the only one I trust to help us out." It was a small loan, he said, just a few thousand, nothing major. She didn't want to cause conflict. She wanted to protect the mood. She agreed. Months later, there were more requests. The money was never returned, and when she finally pushed back, the family turned cold. She became the problem, the disloyal one, the girl who changed after the engagement. Her joy had made her complicit. She didn't pay for trusting too little. She paid for trusting too quickly. This is where the Stoic pause becomes essential, because joy is not dangerous. But unchecked joy is vulnerable. It invites shortcuts. It softens discernment. And most dangerously, it tricks you into believing that good feelings mean good intentions. But they don't. Just as not every argument is rooted in hate, not every smile is rooted in goodwill. Manipulators prefer you elated, not cautious. Because when you're elated, you want to believe. You want to share. You want to carry others with you. And that's when your judgment becomes a gift you give away without realizing. The Stoic doesn't suppress celebration. He disciplines it. He writes the deal but waits to sign. He feels the joy but pauses before acting. Because even good moments deserve slow decisions. Here's a simple practice. Whenever something good happens, recognition, promotion, love, don't immediately accept new invitations. Write them down. Let the high pass. Then ask, would I still say yes if I weren't so euphoric? Because true clarity is not tested in sadness. It's tested in success. You're not weak for wanting to share your joy, but you are responsible for protecting it. Let others celebrate with you, but don't let them decide what you owe. Elias eventually recovered. Not because he chased Victor down, but because he looked in the mirror and asked the hardest question. Did I lose that money, or did I trade it for approval? That's the Stoic shift, from blame to clarity, from regret to recalibration. And Olivia, she set new rules. Now every time joy arrives, she tells herself, this is beautiful, but it's mine. I don't have to turn it into a transaction. Because the moment you realize that joy isn't an invitation for exploitation, that it can exist privately, sacredly, without obligation, that's the moment you become free. And once they can no longer hijack your highs, they can no longer enter through your open door. Michael prided himself on being open. He believed that vulnerability built connection, and connection built trust. At his new job, he quickly bonded with Darren, a colleague who always seemed genuinely curious, someone who asked great questions, listened without judgment, and offered just enough of his own story to feel relatable. At first, it felt refreshing, safe. Michael shared things he hadn't told anyone else, how he sometimes doubted his leadership skills, how his last team had blindsided him with feedback he didn't see coming, how his relationship with his father still weighed on his confidence. Darren nodded, leaned in, said things like, "That must have been tough," and "I admire how honest you are." Michael felt understood, But the questions never stopped. Subtle, casual, planted in passing. Do you ever worry the team doesn't see what you bring? Do you think you're too accommodating sometimes? Are you sure you're being heard in those meetings? They didn't sound threatening. They sounded like concern. Then one day during a performance review, Michael was blindsided again. His manager brought up concerns about his confidence, his emotional distractions, his leadership inconsistency. Phrases Michael recognized, not from his own assessments, but from late-night talks with Darren. And just like that, the puzzle pieces snapped together. Darren hadn't been listening to comfort. He'd been listening to extract. He never had to lie. All he had to do was ask. This is a form of manipulation rarely recognized because it feels like intimacy, not interrogation. But it's one of the oldest techniques in emotional control. Weaponized curiosity. Not every question is a bridge. Some are blueprints. And the person asking isn't always trying to connect. Sometimes they're building a map they can later use to steer you. Stoicism offers a clear line here. Just because a question is gentle doesn't mean it's harmless. Epictetus warned, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." Not just to be humble, but to be cautious. The Stoic doesn't answer every question. He studies the ask. Because questions in the wrong hands are probes. Every answer you give, especially about your weaknesses, gives someone else the coordinates of your inner fault lines. And the manipulator, they don't push, they wait. They let you reveal, in your own words, the very scripts they'll later use to influence how others see you, or how you see yourself. Michael thought he was being real, but he was being recorded, not by devices, by memory, by strategy. So ask yourself, do the people who question you ever reveal anything in return? Do they offer vulnerability? Or do they always keep the spotlight on your emotions, your past, your doubts? If the balance always leans one way, you're not in a conversation. You're in a soft interrogation. This is what we call the invisible interview. No desk, no light in your face, just questions, timed with empathy, that slowly guide you into overexposure. And once you've said it out loud, once you've admitted the thing you hope no one would ask, they don't need to break your defenses. You've lowered them yourself. The Stoic response is not to hide, it's to withhold with wisdom, to ask internally, what's the purpose of sharing this? Will this build trust or hand over control? Am I explaining to feel seen or to be safe? Because the moment you're explaining to be safe, you're already in the wrong room. True connection is mutual. It's not built on one person bleeding emotionally while the other holds the clipboard. If they always ask but never offer, you're not being heard. You're being harvested. Michael left that job eventually, not in anger, but in clarity. He realized that silence wasn't passive, it was power. That his inner narrative didn't need to be laid bare to feel valid. That not all questions deserved answers. Some only deserve distance. The Stoic chooses what to reveal not based on pressure, but on principle. He knows that clarity is preserved through discipline, that not everything true needs to be said. That emotional honesty without discernment becomes emotional vulnerability in disguise. So the next time someone asks you something that feels too specific, too probing, too perfectly timed, pause. Observe not just the question, but the intention behind it. Because the moment you stop answering everything, you start regaining control over your story. And once they can no longer extract your truth, they lose the script they were counting on to shape your identity. Not every manipulator looks like a villain, not every question is laced with malice, and not every act of control begins with someone else. Sometimes the manipulator is you. That's the hardest truth to sit with. It doesn't come with sharp teeth or cruel intent. It comes with phrases like, "I just needed them to understand," or "I didn't want them to feel that way," or worse, I only said that because I knew it would get through. You thought you were helping. You thought you were guiding, but you were still playing with the strings. There's a moment in every honest life when we have to admit, we've asked questions not to understand, but to corner. We've shared insights not to support, but to subtly influence. We've withheld truths not to protect, but to maintain advantage. And it doesn't mean you're evil, it means you're human. Because control in its subtlest form often dresses like care. You tell yourself, I just didn't want to hurt them. But what you really mean is, I didn't want them to act in ways I couldn't predict. You think silence is mercy, but sometimes it's strategy. You think explaining is connection, but sometimes it's manipulation disguised as clarity. The Stoic doesn't just question the world, he questions himself. He asks, am I helping or managing? Am I listening or waiting for the moment I can reframe what they said? Am I guiding or gently coercing with soft phrasing and well-placed pauses? This is where real power begins, not in domination, but in restraint. Imagine the last time you told someone a version of the truth, strategically placed for effect. Imagine the last time you asked a question that you already knew the answer to, just to hear how they'd squirm. Imagine the last time you said, I'm just being honest, when what you really meant was, I'm using truth as a weapon. Most people have done this, not with cruelty, but with fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of losing control, fear of being misunderstood unless they shape the story first. But Stoicism isn't about shaping stories. It's about standing in the rawness of truth, even when it's unpolished, misunderstood, or misread. It's about trusting that clarity doesn't require manipulation. It only requires alignment. Because the most dangerous manipulation doesn't come from malice. It comes from the subtle belief that you know better than someone else what they need, what they should hear, or how they should act. And when that belief seeps in, we become the very thing we swore we'd defend against. Self-honesty is brutal. It shatters the hero narrative, but it builds something far more resilient: self-mastery. The Stoic doesn't avoid hard truths. He invites them. He learns to sit with the shame of, I've done that, without collapsing into guilt or denial. He simply says, now I see it. Now I choose differently. Because once you see the pattern in yourself, it becomes impossible to fall for it in others. When you recognize how gentle control feels from the inside, how tempting it is to steer people instead of witnessing them, you stop mistaking other people's softness for safety. You stop thinking they're just concerned and start asking, what do they gain from this narrative? That's when the manipulation loses its grip. Not because it disappears, but because it's mirrored and seen. Real freedom is not only when you stop being manipulated, it's when you stop needing to manipulate others. And that shift, that deep, private reversal, is where Stoic strength is forged. You don't need to confess this to the world. You don't need to apologize for every time you cross that invisible line. But you do need to stop crossing it. The next time you find yourself about to ask a leading question, pause. The next time you want to share something helpful that just so happens to benefit your position, pause. The next time you feel the urge to steer someone's perception through silence, omission, or timing, pause. Not out of shame, but out of clarity. Because restraint isn't cold, it's conscious. And once you become aware of the subtle power you hold, when you choose not to use it, that's when others stop being pawns and you stop being the player. And perhaps for the first time, both of you become free. Now that you've seen the pattern, the smile that gathers intel, the kindness that collects power, the soft voice that subtly steers, it's time to talk about defense. But not the kind built on confrontation. Not the kind that demands loud boundaries or public declarations. The Stoic way is different, quieter, sharper, more enduring, because the most effective defense against manipulation is not outrage, It's unreadability. Let's begin there. The first principle, pause before response. The manipulator thrives on speed. They count on your reflex, your eagerness to please, your need to explain or clarify. They want you to fill the silence so they can study your patterns. But when you pause, just a breath longer than expected, you interrupt their loop. You introduce uncertainty. And uncertainty is something they can't script. Stillness in the face of emotional pressure is not passivity, it's power. It's how clarity breathes. When you pause, you regain access to your judgment before someone else hijacks it. Ask yourself, am I responding to truth or to tone, to clarity or to their urgency? The second principle, observe energy, not language. Words lie, patterns don't. The manipulator may say, I care, but their actions leave you drained. They may say, I just want to understand, but their curiosity feels like a spotlight, not a sanctuary. Learn to detect emotional bandwidth theft, where someone constantly needs you to explain, justify, or comfort them while giving nothing in return. A Stoic watches tone, pacing, patterns of presence. Who only calls when they need something? Who flatters you after you've expressed doubt? Who asks questions that make you spiral? Energy doesn't lie. Presence is the real punctuation. The third principle, guard what you reveal. You are under no obligation to offer your story to everyone who asks nicely. The modern world pushes vulnerability as virtue, but the Stoic knows that unearned vulnerability is not bravery, it's exposure. Just because someone seems trustworthy doesn't mean they've earned access. Test them with time. Observe what they share about themselves. If the flow is one way, that's not intimacy, it's interrogation. Choose disclosure deliberately, not as a reflex, not as an apology for existing. You do not need to be known quickly to be respected deeply. The fourth principle, act from alignment, not guilt. Guilt is the favored currency of manipulators. After all I've done, I just thought you were different. You used to be so kind. These are not truths, they're tools. The Stoic filters every action through one question. Is this aligned with my principles, or am I just avoiding discomfort? And if it's the latter, the answer must be no. Kindly, firmly, without shame. Because when you act from alignment, you build something manipulators can't decode: consistency. And consistency is difficult to exploit. The fifth principle, let silence finish the sentence. You don't need to correct every accusation. You don't need to clarify every misunderstanding. You don't need to win every interpretation of who you are. The Stoic understands that identity is not reputation. It's the repetition of values. Let others fill the space with noise. You remain still. Let your restraint be the final punctuation. These are not passive strategies. They are chosen stillness. They are the discipline of clarity. Because a fortress doesn't shout, it simply doesn't fall. And in the world of emotional manipulators, that's enough. Because when they can't predict your reaction, when they can't mine your story, when they can't bend your decisions with guilt, and when your silence doesn't beg for correction, they lose the only weapon they ever had: control. That's the Stoic defense. Not armor made of anger, but inner architecture built from discernment. You don't have to raise your voice to reclaim your power. You don't have to prove someone wrong to protect your mind. You don't need to expose the manipulator, tear them down, or win the conversation. All you need is to stop being readable. Let them knock. Let them ask. Let them twist silence into suspicion, but give them nothing they can shape. No emotional leak, no guilt to hold, no story they can finish on your behalf. This is not cruelty, it's clarity. Because when you no longer feed the pattern, you end the loop. And when you end the loop, you stop dancing in their game. From the beginning, you were taught that kindness means openness, that love means explanation, that honesty means telling everything. But the Stoic sees differently. He knows that freedom doesn't come from being fully seen, it comes from being sovereign. You're not here to be transparent to everyone. You're here to live in alignment with what cannot be controlled. So when someone says, "Why are you so distant?" you smile gently and say nothing, because not all truths deserve translation. When someone tries to twist your silence into shame, remember this: silence is not absence, it is precision. And in a world addicted to exposure, your restraint is rebellion. No one can manipulate what they cannot map. No one can distort what they cannot read. And no one can own what you've never given away. You don't need louder boundaries. You need quieter intentions. You don't need to declare your independence. You simply need to embody it in your choices, your pace, your peace. So here's your invitation. Practice saying less, observe more. Hold what matters close, not because you're afraid, but because you're no longer performing access. And when the manipulator returns, curious, familiar, smiling, let them knock on the door of your silence and realize no one lives there anymore. That's how you outsmart them. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with unreadability. If this message found you in a moment of reflection, don't rush. Sit with it. Let it settle in your nervous system like armor made of stillness. Then share it, not because it's viral, but because someone out there is still explaining themselves to the wrong person, and they need a way out. Comment the word unreadable if this unlocks something for you. And if you're ready to live with more clarity, more power, and fewer explanations, you know where to find us.